Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you back to May 31st, 1909, Memorial Day in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. President William H. Taft is standing beneath a gleaming new monument to the United States regulars. The 85-foot tall obelisk with bronze markers wrapped around its base paid tribute to the U.S. Regular Army soldiers who fought in the momentous battle. 4 cavalry regiments, 11 infantry regiments, and a battalion of engineers. President Taft is in his first year as president and commander in chief. And like so many presidents since Abraham Lincoln, they decided to stop by Gettysburg to use it as a way to talk about the future. This time, the tribute was to the regulars, and some would say that the tribute was overdue by 40 years, might have had that memorial a little bit earlier. But in some ways, the address was quite timely because it came at a time when the nation had clearly outgrown the founders' original idea of having a relatively small federal military force that could expand during emergencies, and it would be expanded by local militia. And then once the emergency was over, the local militia would shrink back down to a tiny military. So that was the original concept for having protection from an army instead of a large standing army. Of course, that had changed by the early 20th century because the country had evolved greatly and was now a global leader. I want to share Taft's address with you because it captures a moment in time, and against the backdrop of Gettysburg, it has even more weight. And there's some connections to today. So here we go. Here is the president. We are gathered at this historic spot today to dedicate a monument to the memory of the officers and the enlisted men of the regular army who gave up their lives for the country in the 3 days battle. It is but a tardy recognition of the nation's debt to its brave defenders whose allegiance was purely to the nation, without local color or strengthening of state or municipal pride. The danger of a standing army centered by our ancestors is seen in the constitutional restrictions and the complaints registered in the Declaration of Independence. It has always been easy to awaken prejudice against the possible aggressions of a regular army and a professional soldiery, and correspondingly difficult to create among the people that love and pride in the army, which we find today and frequently in the history of the country aroused on behalf of the Navy. This has led to a varied and changeable policy in respect to the regular army. At times, it has been reduced to almost nothing. In 1784, there were but 80 men who constituted the regular army of the United States, and in Battery F of the 4th Artillery were 55 of them. But generally, the absolute necessities in the defense of the country against the small wars, which embrace so large a part of our history, have induced the maintenance of a regular force, small to be sure, but one so well trained and effective as always to reflect credit upon the nation. In the War of 1812, we had a regular army of 10,000 men. Trained as such an army would have been, we should have been spared the humiliation of the numerous levies of untrained troops and the enormous expense of raising an army on paper of 400,000 or 500,000 men, because with an effective force of 10,000 men, we might have promptly captured Canada and ended the war. The service rendered by the regular army in the Mexican War was far greater in proportion than that which it rendered in the Civil War, and the success which attended the campaigns of Taylor and Scott were largely due to that body of men. To the little army of 25,000 men that survived the Civil War, we owe the opening up of the entire Western country. The hardships and trials of frontier Indian campaigns, which made possible the construction of the Pacific railroads, have never been fully recognized by our people, and the bravery and courage and economy of force compared with the task performed shown by our regular troops have never been adequately commemorated by Congress or the nation. Today, as a result of the Spanish War, the added responsibilities of our new dependencies in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and for some time in Cuba, together with a sense of the importance of our position as a world power, have led to the increase of our regular army to a larger force than ever before in the history of the country, but not larger in proportion to the increase in population and wealth than in the early years of the Republic. It should not be reduced. The profession of arms has always been an honorable one, and under conditions of modern warfare, it has become highly technical and requires years of experience and study to adapt the officers and men to its requirements. The general purpose of Congress and the American people, if one can say there is a plan or purpose, is to have such a nucleus as a regular army that it may furnish a skeleton for rapid enlargement in time of war to a force 10 or 20 times its size, and at the same time be an appropriate instrument for accomplishing the purposes of the government in crisis likely to arise other than a war. At West Point, we have been able to prepare a body of professional soldiers well trained to officer an army and numerous enough at the opening of the Civil War to give able commanders to both sides of that internecine strife. Upon the one side, the North, many of the officers were drafted to command the volunteer troops from the states, while the regular army, aggregating about 10,000 at the opening of the war, was increased to about 25,000 during its first year. More than half this army was engaged in the Battle of Gettysburg. 11 regiments of infantry, 5 regiments of cavalry, 26 batteries of artillery, and 3 battalions of engineers. The infantry of the regular army were embraced in 2 brigades of the 3rd Division of the 5th Corps under Major General Sykes. That's George Sykes, himself a most able regular army officer. The cavalry was included in a reserve division under General Wesley Merritt, and the batteries were distributed among various army corps of the entire federal force. 2 of the most important and determining crises of the 3 days battle were, first, the seizure of the Round Tops and the maintenance of the federal control over that great point of vantage, the possession of which by the Confederate forces would have taken the whole federal line in the reverse. And the second was the resistance to Pickett's charge on the 3rd day of the battle, when the high point in the Confederate advance into Pennsylvania was turned and Lee was defeated and hurried back into Southern territory, never again to plant his Confederate battle flags on Northern soil. The taking of the Round Tops and the driving back of the Confederate forces was the work of Sykes' 5th Army Corps, and especially of the 2 brigades of the regular infantry regiments, in which, in killed and wounded alone, the regulars lost 20% of their full number, and some of their brigades, notably Burbank's, lost 60% in killed and wounded of the men engaged. With a desperate bravery worthy of the cause, they drove back the Confederate forces and enabled General George Gordon Meade to unite the left of General Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps with the right of the 5th Army Corps, and thus presented a shorter but firmer front with which to withstand the onslaught of Lee's army upon the 3rd day. Without invidious comparison, and in no way detracting from the courage and glory of the other branches of the service who united to resist Pickett's charge, it is well known that much of the effective resistance was by the artillery. The batteries of the regulars and volunteers under General Henry Hunt made the resistance to that awful charge and gave the victory to the Union forces. The soul of Cushing, in charge of Battery F, 4th Artillery, went up with the smoke of the last shots, which sent Pickett's men reeling back from the point now marked as the high tide of the Confederacy. Time does not permit me to mention the names of the heroes of the regular army whose blood stained this historic field and whose sacrifices made the Union victory possible. With my intimate knowledge of the regular army, their high standard of duty, their efficiency as soldiers, their high character as men, I have seized this opportunity to come here to testify to the pride which the nation should have in its regular army and to dedicate this monument to the predecessors of the present regular army on a field in which they won undying glory and the perpetual gratitude from the nation which they served. They had not the local associations. They had not the friends and neighbors of the volunteer forces to see to it that their deeds of valor were properly recorded and the value of their services suitably noted in the official records by legislation, congressional action, and they have now to depend upon the truth of history and in the cold, calm retrospect of the war as it was to secure from Congress this suitable memorial of the work in the saving of the country which they wrought here. So there you have the words of President William Howard Taft. He's talking about the regular army. He provides a concise history of the regular army and how it was growing and needed to grow and shrink in times of war, and how that army was expanding over time as America's power and influence expanded. Also note that he mentions the U.S. Army during the Indian War period and how they didn't exactly get their due from the people in Congress. And that's still a controversy, one that is still really undecided, at least the idea of the use of troops and the deployment and the subjugation of the Native American people. So there you have it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.